The good of the order will now be conducted by the worthy lecturer. I trust to the enjoyment, instruction, and edification of all present. All yours, Chris.
Thank you, worthy Grand Knight, for the good of the order. I'd like to begin with a condensed version of a presentation I gave about this time a year ago in the run-up to the 4th of July holiday, because it has to do with the origins of our country. And I'm going to do it, I think, through a timeline. It's probably the simplest way to keep it moving. 1532, King Henry VIII broke with Rome. He declared himself to be the head of the Church of England and initiated the English Reformation. And of course, this led to a period of persecution for Catholics in England. In 1580, the Jesuits established the Mission to England, which was an effort to train priests to go into England undercover and minister to the underground church, the people who had remained faithful to the Catholic Church in England. 1603, James VI of Scotland becomes King James I of England. James was not much interested in religious matters, and he initially attempted to pursue a policy of religious tolerance, but others in the government did not share that view, and by this point in time, you had a long history of friction between the Protestants and the Catholics in England. And so 1605, Guy Fawkes, a dissident Catholic, tried to blow up Parliament while the king was present. It's called the Gunpowder Plot. You probably heard about that. And it led to a severe crackdown against Catholics in England. They were barred from attending university. They were barred from many professions. Magistrates had standing authority to search their homes, etc., etc. 1607, the Virginia Company establishes Jamestown Colony, the first permanent English settlement in the New World. 1609 to 1610, the winter of 1609 to 1610 is now known as the starving time. It was a particularly difficult winter. The resupply ships that were supposed to resupply the colony were wrecked off the coast of Bermuda, never made it. 3/4 of the colonists starved to death during the winter of 1609-1610. 1619, the first African slaves arrived at Jamestown. And they came from a part of Africa that had been under Portuguese control for about 150 years. And they were likely Catholic, so add that in the back of your mind. 1699, the capital of Virginia was moved to Williamsburg, and Jamestown was abandoned. 1956, the first archaeological surveys conducted at Jamestown. 1980s, there's some more survey work done. 1996, the Jamestown Rediscovery Project begins. And it was initially intended to simply be a season or two of additional archaeological investigation. But they made so many important finds that they've been able to get additional funding, and they continue to this day. And from the very beginning, going all the way back to 1996, the Jamestown Rediscovery Project has been turning up anomalous Catholic artifacts, rosaries, crucifixes, religious medals, things that are out of context in what should have been a staunchly Protestant settlement. Initially, these were thought to be trade goods, things that had turned up in grandma's junk drawer when she passed, that the colonists brought with them to trade to the Indians. But the sheer number of them and the fact that they continue to be found is sort of slowly eroding that view. 2010, the foundation of the original church was found. This would have been an Anglican church. 2013, excavation work at the church uncovered 5 graves. It used to be the practice to reserve a few burial plots actually inside the church, in the chancel, near the altar, for honored burials. 2015, the 5 people buried here were identified. And there's a footnote. I need a little explanation. It was the practice to bury people with their heads to the west and their feet to the east, so that when they would rise east toward Jerusalem and hopefully see the return of Jesus. But there was an exception to that. Catholic priests were buried the other way around, with heads to the east and feet to the west, so that when they rose, they would not, rather than looking toward Jerusalem, they would look upon the joyous faces of the people that they had helped to save. One of these graves is wrong way around. They're all, four of them are buried heads to the west to face east. One of them is the other direction, buried in the orientation that would normally be reserved for a Catholic priest. Again, something that makes no sense in a staunchly Protestant context. Well, they eventually identified who all five of these people were. And the guy that's wrong way around is Captain Gabriel Archer, one of the leaders of the expedition. He had his captain's staff with him, which was his mark of authority, but that's not the only thing he was buried with. At his feet, they found a hexagonal silver box, about 4 inches long, and it had a crudely scratched circle with the letter M inside of it. That's been under study now for the last 5 years or so, and a number of interesting things have been found out about it. It was, for example, subject to CT scan at Yale, and it contains 6 little fragments of bone and 2 little lead ampullae, little tiny bottles that would once have contained blood or holy water or a blessed oil. Again, completely out of context in a staunchly Protestant environment. It's clearly a reliquary. It's clearly a Catholic artifact. Relics is a fascinating subject that I hope to have an opportunity to speak about at greater length at some point in the future. But let me just say that keeping and veneration of relics is something that has deep roots in ancient Judaism. It comes right into the early church. In the book of Revelation, for example, chapter 6, we read about the souls of the martyrs crying out from under the altar of heaven. Why are they under the altar? Well, because on earth, their remains were under the altars of the churches here on earth. So that practice of praying over graves and keeping relics in sacred spaces was already present at the time the book of Revelation was written, around 90 AD. So just interesting little footnote. So analysis of the box shows that it has been repurposed. It was not originally made as reliquary. It was originally the base for something, probably a crucifix. That's important because it strongly suggests that this is was something salvaged from a church when Protestants ransacked it and destroyed all of the art in the sort of convulsive periods of the Reformation. So what does all this mean? Well, Captain Gabriel Archer is an interesting figure. He grew up in Essex, which was a hotbed of recusant Catholic activity. Recusants was the word the English used for people who remained Catholic and refused to recognize the king or queen as the head of the church. Court records show that Archer's parents and his brother got into legal trouble because they were recusant Catholics. Archer attended Cambridge University, which is suspicious, I'll say, because Cambridge was one of the places where the Jesuit mission was able to successfully infiltrate. A lot of the professors and administrative staff at Cambridge were secretly Catholic and were there in those positions to try to train the next generation of English leaders, one, to be Catholic if possible, and two, to at least be tolerant and sympathetic to Catholics. So it seems that Archer was almost certainly a recusant Catholic, notwithstanding some of the his public presentation to the contrary. Archer was buried in Jamestown with this reliquary at his feet, which means that the Protestants in Jamestown must have known that he was Catholic, and they gave him an honored burial inside their church anyway. This is important because it tells us that from the very beginning, Catholics were present in the English settlements in the New World, and it tells us that the religious picture is not the sort of standard historical version. Many people came to the New World starting in 1607 with the Jamestown settlement to have greater religious freedom, to get away from the religious conflicts that were underway in Europe at the time. So public statements and to the contrary Jamestown seems to have been a mixed Protestant Catholic environment in which the Catholics were not only accepted, but held leadership positions and so on. So I think that's worth knowing as we approach the 4th of July holidays. We think about the origins of this country. We think about, where we come from as a nation. One mystery remains: who's the saint whose relics spent 400 years buried in the Virginia Tidewater? Well, we don't know that with certainty, but we can make a pretty good educated guess. We know that this was repurposed during the Protestant Reformation. We know the original silversmith didn't scratch the letter M on it. We know that the object came from it was almost certainly rescued from a church. That tells us that we're probably talking about the relics of one of the English martyrs, somebody who was executed for being a Catholic during the time of the English Reformation. So we also know that that the reliquary came down through the Archer family. We know that Archer is from Essex. We know he went to Cambridge. We can put these things together, and one candidate sort of bubbles up to the surface. St. Cuthbert Maine. Cuthbert Maine was an English convert to Catholicism who went to France, went to seminary, became a priest, and returned to England in 1576, where he went to work officially as a butler in the home of a wealthy man named Francis Trajan, unofficially, of course, as a priest. He was arrested in June of 1577 after a search of Trajan's home turned up his vestments and other priestly paraphernalia. He was executed in later that year, November of 1577. He was drawn and quartered. And he is, so of course, recognized by the church as a saint because of his martyrdom. He was offered his life in exchange for renouncing his faith, which he refused to do. He actually ministered in Cornwall, which is on the other side of England from Essex, but it turns out there's a connection between the two areas. They were both sort of hotbeds of recusant Catholic activity, and when the priest hunters would come to try to round up the closeted priests in Cornwall, they would all leave and go to Essex, where there were safe houses, and vice versa. When the priest hunters went to Essex, the priests who were ministering in Essex went and hid out in Cornwall. So it's not surprising that we would find this Cornish martyrs' remains coming down through a line of people who lived in Essex. So I offer that up as something I just, as an interesting bit of trivia and history as we approach the 4th of July holiday. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Chris.
you.
That was
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
very interesting. I look
Excellent.
forward to hearing what you have for our next meetings coming up down the road.